While I'm up here, Liz, I might go back a little bit for a minute if I can. When you're talking about the Rockefellers, they're not so much in play now with the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum is primarily Rothschild funded. And an interesting thing from that we're picking up from our contacts is there's a huge behind-the-scenes war going on between the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds at the moment. Charles is a Rothschild asset, not a Rockefeller asset. The Gates is a Rothschild asset. Biden is a Rothschild asset. What has happened is the trigger for the war between the two elite groups who used to work together is that the Rothschilds violated their agreement with the Rothschilds, the Rothschilds violated their agreement with the Rockefellers to stay out of North America. They moved into North America through the insurance industry and into Wall Street that way, and by taking over the insurance industry, they took over medical insurance in America, which runs the hospital system, and then interfaced with Big Pharma. So Big Pharma was Rockefeller-dominated in North America, but Rothschild-dominated in Europe. It's now dominated by Rothschild. So the global pandemic stuff, the vaccination stuff, is a Rothschild operation. There was contribution originally made at the early stages during the design stages with Operation Lockstep back in 2010 by the Rockefellers, but they've since fallen out. One of the key Rothschilds has been recently found hanging from the ceiling of his apartment in Paris. Two Rockefellers have been killed in their car in Manhattan Plaza outside the Rockefellers' headquarters by a bomb. There's a whole lot of other stuff going on. The Rockefellers are now backing Trump because they want to get the Rothschilds out of North America. So I would say at the moment the Rockefellers are the lesser of two evils. This country and Australia are very definitely Rothschild territory. The Rothschilds run the intelligence services in most of the Five Eyes countries outside of the United States. Yeah, that's right. There's a Rothschild winery down in Cromwell as well. Yeah, absolutely. There's quite a lot of Rothschild land here. They invest in tulip farming down out of in West Otago, down at Tapanui. There's all kinds of Rothschild money here, but they're moving very strongly into the wine industry. Sorry. Why shouldn't we be? Well, that's a good question. We'll find that out. They're moving very strongly into the New Zealand wine industry. That's Rothschild money, and some of them come out here for a bit of a holiday, kind of a break. They consider this to be a safe place to come. So that may not be the case. Yeah. So what we're seeing at the moment in Australia, there's a battle between the Rockefellers and Rothschild for control there. The military in Australia is aligned with the American military, which is Rockefeller, but there are elements in the American military that are aligned with Trump as well. And Trump has an agreement with the Rockefellers. They will assist him to the degree that he gets the Rothschilds out of North America. So that's kind of good news. So some of the bad guys may be useful against the other bad guys. But the banking system outside America is Rothschild. And that was the other reason for the fallout between those two cartels, was the Rothschilds tried to take over the banking system in America with a drive on the Fed. So there's a battle going on for the control of the Federal Reserve at the moment. So yeah, and Trump took that back towards Citibank, which was the Rockefeller Bank, pardon me.
So, Brendan, with people of this level of ego, ruthlessness, greed, all the ghastliness in them, can New Zealand say, get out, we don't want to?
Yeah, we can.
Get lost.
It'll be it won't be easy. It'll be a transitional process. There are certain things that the big difference that I've seen, and I've worked in areas in protection areas around the, bodyguarding the elite and various other things that I've done, is the big difference between the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers is this. The Rothschilds, we'll start with the Rockefellers. They want to control the energy resources of the world, primarily oil, the atomic industry, and petroleum distribution. So where there's oil, there's Rockefellers. So that was the interest, that was the Gulf War, moving on Iraq and so on. And the reason that they moved into Iraq was because the Rothschilds did a deal with Saddam that he would only sell oil for euros, which is Rothschild money. And that destabilized the American petrodollar, which was Rockefeller money, and that really upset the apple cart. So that caused the Gulf War. The battle now is that if the Rockefellers control the energy, at the moment they're happy to leave people alone. The Rothschilds, however, want to own everything, including you. Right, so that's your difference. So I'm not saying the Rockefellers are good by any means, and I'm not a Rockefeller advocate. However, they are the lesser of two evils. Okay. And as I say, there's a battle at the moment going on in Australia between the Labor Party government there, which is Rothschild, and the Rockefellers who run the mining and mineral industry in Australia and control the defence establishment in Australia. So you see a massive increase in US military activity and the procurement of a classic example actually happened recently. How many of you are aware of the Australian nuclear submarine program? All right, what happened there? What happened there was the Australians had ordered submarines from the French, and they ordered a non-nuclear variation of the French Barracuda-class nuclear subs. And that was to be the biggest Rothschild defence industry sale in history, because the defence industry in France is owned by the Rothschild. Rockefellers got involved in this. They said, we can't let those guys have that. So they agreed to sell the Australians, because the Australians wanted nuclear subs anyhow, US nuclear submarines. And that tipped the whole Rothschild defence deal over. And that caused the President of France, Macron, to withdraw the ambassador from Canberra, and Australia and France no longer have diplomatic relations like they used to. That brought Australia into the American orbit again, and the Americans immediately agreed to sell the Australians nuclear submarines. They will have a nuke sub fleet bigger than China's in 10 years. So, well, that's actually a good thing, because it offsets the Chinese presence in the South Pacific. So there's some useful geopolitics there.
Still risk in our waters, though.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But well, nuclear submarine propulsion is safe. Nuclear weapons, not so much, but there hasn't been a nuclear submarine accident or a weapon accident since nuclear submarines started. So, aside from 2 Russian subs that sank to the bottom. Yeah. The nuclear thing, again, has to be subject of a debate. So the battle is on in Australia between the Rockefellers and Rothschild. My money's on the Rockefellers, and they're interested in the oil field down here already, because they were involved in the last exploration operation when Anadarko and Exxon were exploring before. Ardern cancelled oil exploration because she was asked by the Rothschilds to provide collateral for her loans. So that oil fields are collateral for labourers borrowing. So, it's a very interesting space and highly contested at all levels, including the big globalist levels who no longer love each other. That works very well for us.
Wow. Have you got documentation on that, the oil field deal, where you're saying Ardern offered the oil field as a collateral for it?
I don't have documentation on that.
Curious. I'm not questioning it.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you've got the documentation for that.
I don't have the documentation for that.
It would be interesting to get.
It would be very interesting to get. It would be a very interesting question to ask, because the mineral fields and other assets of New Zealand were also put up as collateral. That's how she was able to double the borrowing in 5 years.
Brendan, can we, in your view, cancel those sorts of things as illegal contracts? Because we were not consulted about that. She was representing us. If the people don't know, how can it be a contract that stands?
You may be able to. You would have to be in a position to do that. You would have to have political power to do that, and you would then have to perhaps put it to referendum whether the people would support it or not. So that's, again, a future possibility, or it's an opportunity. You could do anything if you're in the right place.
Yeah.
But that brings me, I guess, to my ultimate question is about government bonds.
Government bonds.
Government bonds.
Could you stand just over and can hear? That would be great. Thank you.
I can't really speak very loudly.
Oh, it's okay. Do you want to come to the microphone? All right. Oh, is that right? Yep.
You'd have to hold on to me.
Oh, fine. Yeah, lovely.
Yeah.
Lovely. That's great.
So we know that government bonds is the mechanism where the government funds itself, right?
Yep.
The sale of government bonds.
Yep. Yep.
If you look at the sequence, the order that government funds themselves, they raise the money from the bonds, the sale of bonds, and you're saying that they're using, traditionally, your question about common law question earlier is tied into this, because our birth certificates have traditionally been the securities for these government bonds.
For the government
now
bonds.
saying that they're selling assets.
They do both. So there are many channels, well, they're not many channels, but there are several channels of government financing. So they can borrow from the IMF.
They can borrow.
They can borrow from the World Bank.
SDRs.
They can, which stand for
Special
drawing rights. They can borrow from the Bank of International Settlement.
Speak up so everyone can hear.
So,
Yeah.
so there are channels which they can borrow from.
To hold on to you.
The party, rather than the government, in the case of the Labor Party, can borrow or take grants from the CCP in China.
That's right.
There are other. The National Party sometimes has had funding from China in the past, from what we can gather. But again, hard to get documentation on those kind of things. the assets of a country are often put up as collateral. The people, as you say, through the birth certificate process, are put up as collateral. Well, the people are, well, that's more the futures market. Because
It's the bond market.
Yeah, they're trading on the taxable value of those people going forward from
And this is my ultimate question.
So what's
is
your question?
The bonds are the mechanism whereby the government controls us. They raise the money.
The bonds are
The bonds are the mechanism whereby whereby the government can control you, because they raise the money, or they create the money via the bond process, the bond sale process, which happens every fortnight or so. Go to the Treasury's Debt Management Office if you want to look at the actual data. But they raise the money, they use that money, that currency, to then pay the police and themselves and the medical world and ...
Yep.
So the way I see it is, unless you get rid of this mechanism whereby they can essentially create money or create currency via the bond process, the bond sale process, then you're not really going to be able to have the mechanism to undo a lot of the
well, you can
shenanigans that are going on.
You can, because you disconnect the birth certificate process. So it's the birth certificate where the tax on future earnings lies. So when a parent registers when a parent registers their baby, the government borrows money to fund that child's education up till the age of maturity, where they go to work, and then they start paying taxes. And the value of those bonds, which are traded, as you say, in the market every fortnight, is based on the taxable earnings of that individual. So when that individual leaves school with XYZ qualifications, they have a statistical probability of employment. If they go to university and they increase those qualifications, they have a higher statistical probability of employment at a higher wage, therefore they pay higher taxes. The taxes are not levied to pay for your schools or your hospitals or your roads or your police forces or courts or any of that stuff. They are paid. They are raised to pay the interest. On borrowings.
Interest. This is the money
taxes
are
about interest. Now, the interest is compounding. Now, to give you an idea, how many of you remember the Robert Muldoon Think Big stuff?
I just wanted your feedback.
You're right. How many of you remember the Robert Muldoon Think Big stuff? All right, Robert Muldoon was the first of the IMF leaders. In fact, Robert Muldoon was rewarded with the chairmanship of the IMF and presidency of the World Bank during the interregnum between him leaving as finance minister under Holyoake and Marshall and going in as prime minister in 1975. So for the 3 years between 72 and 75, Muldoon commuted backwards and forwards to Washington, D.C., where he was both president of the World Bank and chairman of the IMF. It was unusual that the head of a small, well, he wasn't even a prime minister of a small country at that point, he later became prime minister, was the head of the biggest and most powerful intergovernment banks in the world. And he put up New Zealand as the experimental country for refining these processes of doing this. So he started New Zealand down the pathway of government debt. Before that, the government of Norman Kirk refused to borrow from these guys, and Norman Kirk was consequently assassinated in August 1974. So that was done by sodium morphate, which caused his heart to stop while he was in hospital for routine surgery. I'm not kidding you. It's in a thing called the Opal Files, if you want to have a look at that, which is on your website. Now, the Opal Files were...
Has everybody read those Opal Files? You need to go home and read them.
The Opal Files gives you a 20-year history going from the mid-1960s right to the late 1980s. At one time, they were a classified document. They were written by an FBI agent who moved out to New Zealand, and that was part of what was called the Gemstone Files series. And that file series was about the takeover of various countries around the world, and each location was named after a different gemstone. In the case of New Zealand, it was opals. So, interesting reading, so I suggest that to you. But Muldoon started the pathway to debt, and successive leaders in New Zealand have followed that along. Now, we are still paying the compound interest on the debt created by Muldoon, because there is no attempt by any New Zealand government to pay off the principal, so the interest keeps rolling over. It's mostly interest only, like on a bad mortgage. So all the borrowing since then is accruing ever more debt. Anybody know how much interest we pay a second? $200. Anybody know how much interest we pay a day? 18 million a day, New Zealander. 18 million a day. Anybody know how much we borrow a day? 78 million a day. That's not to release or pay off that debt, that is to continue it. None of your taxes that go to buy those services you think you're getting at all Those services are created by bond issue, as the gentleman here has said, or they're created by direct borrowings from international intergovernmental institutions. All right. So it's all interest, folks, and it's all designed to maximise the debt and keep you there, because in debt slavery is bondage. At the moment, the interest rates are going up.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, with the nature of the birth certificate being that they've actually formed a corporation in your name,
Yes?
while they're claiming the tax on the value of that corporation in your name,
Yes?
it's not actually you, except that they get joined, obviously.
They do.
Where, through your naivety and ignorance, you're accepting that liability,
Yes?
offsetting that all the time. All we really need to do, in my opinion, is that we need to give them notification of a change of designation. So rather than allowing them to be the beneficiary of that trust that they created in their name,
Yep.
we switch it to whereby we notify them that they are now the trustee, we are
Yes.
the beneficiary, and we can actually all be quite wealthy immediately overnight.
Absolutely.
Not necessarily abolish anything as far as that structure is concerned, just put into good hands.
Absolutely. Now, that was proposed in a court case, and the judge presiding over that court case threw the case and said, I don't want to be the judge that collapses the New Zealand economy. You may know what I'm talking about. Yeah. Okay, so...
That was a brilliant summary, by the way. That was brilliant, turning it
it's
around.
really good.
Yeah, really, really
Again,
brilliant.
a grassroots solution.
Yeah.
You know.
A grassroots solution. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's brilliant. How quickly we could put things right. On the oil, are you all aware we swim on this great southern basin of oil, some of the finest oil reserves in the world? We could be the Switzerland of the South Pacific.
Actually, what we would be is we would be politically the Switzerland, and we would be the Dubai of the South Pacific.
Yes.
So if you imagine combining Dubai and Switzerland together. So you
The young men and women who are coming into the Navy are actually informed that their job is to defend Oceania and Solandia.
Yep.
The greater region, the underwater part of the continent.
Yep.
It's the fourth largest reserve oil in the world.
Absolutely, and untouched. Now, I spoke to a gentleman yesterday who was involved with Polar Bear and Grizzly Bear, which were the two big exploration vessels down with the Bunker Hunt brothers in the 1990s, 80s and 90s in the Great South Basin. And he was telling me about bringing up oil samples that were pure. What distinguishes the New Zealand oil from any other oil on the planet is it's already in a highly refined state and does not need further refining. It can be brought into fuel use with very little processing. So it's immediately available. So you don't need to build expensive onshore refining facilities. You can build a relatively low-cost refining capability and then bring that oil either for export or for domestic use. Yeah.
One of the other things I just wanted to do, is just when you're talking about this conflict behaviour between Rothschild and Rockefellers, you've got to also remember that both of these hierarchies are nefarious and evil and are deeply involved in human trafficking and other things for their own satisfaction and everything else. So we've got to always remember that ultimately there is still one head at the top of both of them, and that's pure evil.
Absolutely.
So they'll be getting direction from somebody who's controlling both sides, and of course, we don't want to look at favouring one over the other.
So I think my question to you, Brendan, would be this. If we did open up the oil fields, how would the greedies from the Rothschilds not just invade us and say, we'll take it?
Well, a bit of history. Muldoon first made an agreement with Nelson Bunker Hunt in 1967 because the Americans were using a new satellite program which was able to measure the magnetic fields of the Earth, and the presence of oil changes the magnetic field measurable from space. This was back in the 60s. And he had an agreement that he would give the Hunt brothers, who were the second biggest oil company in America after Standard Oil, and they were the Rockefellers' main rival and I suppose you could say enemy. He would give them exclusive access to that oil field, both for exploration and extraction purposes. Oil was discovered, an extraction plan was made, but when the oil was discovered, which was the early 70s after 5 years of exploration, the Rockefellers, together with OPEC, decided they were going to push the oil price up. So how many of you remember the 1973 oil crisis that happened around the Yom Kippur War in Israel, with Israel? And that was deliberately staged so as to drive the price of oil up by creating scarcity and pressure on the Middle Eastern oil fields. And they were able to raise the price of oil by 500%. How many remember Carlist days here? Yep. Well, Carlist days were brought in because of a contrived shortage of oil. And that that caused the Rockefellers to say, we've got to stop any new oil fields happening around the world because they will actually flood the market with oil, cheap oil, and the price will fall back down again, and we won't be able to do our deal with our OPEC friends in Saudi Arabia and so on. So the pressure went on Muldoon to shut the oil field down, and he was paid a much, much bigger bribe by the Rockefellers to do that. So he went back to the Hunts and said, if you start pumping, New Zealand is now going to put a big royalty on every barrel of oil. And the Hunts said, well, we're doing our sums here. It's not economic for us to do that. You do that, we'll pull the pin. And Muldoon did pass that legislation in 1975, and they said, right, we're out of here, we're not going to extract. So that was seen as a potential disruptor to oil prices. So the Standard Oil, the Rockefellers forced Hunt Petroleum out through Muldoon. And Muldoon at that point went on to the Rockefeller payroll through the Trilateral Commission, which was run by David Rockefeller. And the head of the Trilateral Commission in New Zealand was Ron Trotter, who was head of Fletcher Challenge at the time. Some of you might remember him. And they had great interest in New Zealand. They were involved with, the Rockefellers were directly involved with Travel Lodge and all kinds of other things here. So we stayed on the debt wagon there. Muldoon maintained those relationships all the way through to 1984 when he was put out of office by the Long E. Douglas government, and then the Long E. Douglas government maintained those understandings, and the Hunts weren't allowed back in here to get the oil, so the oil was basically sequestered because it was seen as a potential disruptor of global oil prices. So it still sits down there untapped.
But you didn't answer my question. That's fascinating. What would happen if we did say we're going to do it? We're going to pay off the debt using our oil.
Well,
they would come
all right,
in.
to give you an example of what will happen, Norman Kirk threatened to do that in 1973. Because he saw the massive economic impact of the rising oil prices on the New Zealand economy. He had no way of doing it. New Zealand had no way of doing it because we didn't have the technology. Only the Hunts and the Rockefellers, Standard Oil and Royal Dutch Shell, which is Shell BP, they had the technology. None of them would give him the technology. So he approached the Russians for the technology, and that was the Cold War. And the Russians had the technology because they were pulling oil out of their own territory with deep sea technology. And he ended up dead. So he could have ended up dead for several different reasons. One, he didn't want to borrow. Two, he wanted the oil. Taking the oil at that time was seen as a geopolitical threat to the New World Order. The order to eliminate Kirk was given by Richard Nixon at the insistence of Henry Kissinger, who was Secretary of State. He was National Security Advisor to Nixon at the time and carried out by Alexander Haig's State Department and the American intelligence system. So what would happen to us here? It'll be dicey. We would have to go into partnership, I would say, with a second-tier oil company but with big resources. Or we would have to strike a deal somehow with the Rockefellers. Yeah. Okay, now pragmatism plays into politics, and we play a long game here. We have to consider all possibilities because those guys do dominate the global oil system. The other possibility, and it's just a possibility, is that Vladimir Putin is an interesting player at the moment. The Russians do have certain capabilities. I'm not advocating any answer to this question because we're so far away from getting to be in the position to do that. But again, something that would have to be put to the New Zealand people, I would again suggest by proper information and referendum.
That's extraordinary. Thank you, Brendan.